everyone. So this is the CPD that I'm sharing just towards the end of the summer term. It's two parts. It's myself and Jane, and it's all around high expectations. But really, probably the best time to watch this, or to revisit it at least, would be just before we come back in September, because it's very much just sort of a whistle-stop tour of those ideas surrounding having the highest expectations, establishing good routines with your classes. So it would probably be a good thing to just refresh your mind on before you meet your classes for the first time in September. You might be re-meeting classes that you've taught previously, say a year 10 class, but I still think it's an important time to re-establish those expectations, especially in light of how long we've had off from school and how long it's been since students were in that sort of classroom environment as a full group of possibly 30 students at least anyway. So sticking to form, we're going to begin with a retrieval, but really I just thought we would do it as a brain spill, and it was just really a reflection opportunity. What can you remember that makes the good ingredients, if you like, of high quality lessons? So what are all of those things that I'm sure you have buzzing around in your head that you're going to try and incorporate into your lessons when we're back in the classroom? So really that's just a little bit of a reflection memory exercise. Okay, so hopefully many of these things featured in your brain spill. And we've seen this so many times now, but I've highlighted the bits that I think sit alongside this training. And this training's in two parts. There's me doing this bit, which is very much about high expectations in terms of teaching and learning. And then there's Jane doing the bit in terms of high expectations of student behaviour. And obviously there's overlap between the two. But I've added a bit to this in the sense that I've just placed those high expectations at the bottom of this diagram, because obviously underpinning all of this has to be that culture. And we've kind of talked about that before. But every time we sort of use our questioning techniques, probing questions, ask a student to say it again better, yes, we're checking understanding, and that's obviously really important. But what we're also doing is we're just gently reminding students of that culture of a higher expectation, where we're saying, well, I'm not going to accept that because you didn't use a full sentence or you didn't explain that fully. You can do better than that. And it's just that constant underlying sort of tone of, you can do better than that. And I really have got the highest expectations of you. And it's in a warm way. It's, and I'll talk a bit about that in some of the examples that I share. It's with a warmth and a kind of a real wanting that student to perform at their best, rather than them always ripping them down because they can do better than that. There's a real difference there, isn't there? Okay, so I've said it's in two parts, and I'm going to focus on the high expectations around everything to do with our teaching, and of course that includes the curriculum and the expectations that we have on our students in terms of their learning, the work they produce, the responses that they give. So I've drawn upon three sources, I would say, in putting this together. The walkthroughs that we've obviously all got a copy of. So I've given page references for that, where I've referenced that because you've obviously got your own copy to look at. The Teach Like a Champion I've referred to in a couple of other CPDs, and I've got a couple of clips in there. And also another book that the teachers collectively from the Michaela School in London have produced, called The Power of Culture, which is also fascinating, and I've stolen a few ideas from there as well. But actually what's interesting and good is that all these are totally aligned. So the Michaela School bases a lot of its principles and practices on the work of Doug Lemov, and the works of the walkthrough, Tom Sherrington and Oliver Cavalioghi, they also are very much building on the same ideas. So there's not a kind of mismatch between them. So I'm going to start with this idea of we're thinking about meeting our classes in September, and let's make sure we get those expectations established, and particularly in terms of routines. So there is a walkthrough, it's page 38 of your book, and it talks about this process of, first of all, of course, you've got to define or to decide yourself what your expectations are. And that's from start to finish. And I think this would be a really useful exercise for everybody to do. I know I've kind of done it for myself as well. Start from the very beginning and imagine a lesson. What's your expectations in terms of how they enter the room? Are they lining up outside? How are they entering? Do you expect them to do it in silence? Because that will make it a lot speedier and lead to a calm beginning. And then what should they do when they sit down? And how should equipment be handed out? And what should they be getting out on their desks? And even things like, how do you expect them to listen? Now, I know that sounds really obvious, but actually, do you expect them to look at the person talking? Because a lot of the time in our classrooms, that doesn't happen. But it's fine if we say that it should. We've just got to be really explicit about our expectations. How do you expect them to answer questions? I've highlighted that there because that's the first thing I'm going to kind of concentrate on here and give you a few examples. How should they set their work out when they're working in their books? How should they leave the room? So literally, and there'll be many more things in between. And literally, I think it would be really useful exercise to just sort of think through the lesson and think about all the possibilities. And then you decide how it's going to work in your classroom for all of your groups. And then this isn't a case of, in lesson 1, going through all of these as rules and rules and rules. This is a case of communicating it all the time. Okay, so this is how we hand out the equipment, please, guys, and we wanted to do it really quickly and promptly, and we don't make a fuss. No, you don't need to be turning around, thank you. That kind of thing, just really communicating it quickly and warmly, and model it. So for things like how we expect them to listen, model it. When a student is talking, you're looking at the student and you say, do you see how I'm looking at them because they're answering? You should be turning around, you should be looking at them because they're talking. That's how we listen in this classroom. And lots and lots of that at the beginning until it becomes routine, until they don't need any reminders. But in the walkthrough, I quite liked that way, and I've kind of broken the steps down at the bottom. You decide them, you communicate them, you're going to have to reinforce them. And of course, there will be times where a child needs redirecting to, do you remember how we do things? And they'll need correcting, and sometimes they'll need challenging on things. But you have to sustain it. And of course, that's the really hard bit. But, it pays off, of course, if you do. And I know we all have our routines, and this is nothing new to us. But actually, that opportunity to start afresh at the beginning of September and to re-establish those, I think will be really helpful. So I am going to focus on this one about how they answer questions. And this is taken from the Teach Like a Champion book. Again, I'm going to move myself out the way. And I'll just let you read that. Sorry if it's not brilliantly clear. It was just a photo. Okay, now it's a bit tongue-in-cheek and it's a bit over the top, but it's trying to give you that student view. And actually, I think we could probably all spot things in there that we've fallen for. Just start rambling on about fairness and justice, and she'll not notice that you've not answered the question that she asked you. Or, just regurgitate everything, and then something in what you say will be right, and they'll repeat that bit back to you to let you know that was the right bit. And what we've got to do is we've got to try and ensure that our students can't get away with that, because they're probably not doing it consciously, to be honest. But we have to set the expectation that if we ask them a question, we need to see their knowledge or their understanding on that question. So therefore, they have to answer that question, and that we expect them to be precise, and we expect them to use the right language and the right appropriate methods. And so we have to set that bar high to make sure they don't try these strategies out on us. So that the first couple, as they called them there, the kitchen sink, you know, regurgitating absolutely everything, and the bait and switch, the hoping that, you know, you can avoid the question or answer a different question. Obviously, what we need to do for both of those is we need to bring the students back to the question that we've asked them. And this little video clip here that I'm going to show you, again, taken from the Teach Like a Champion series of video clips. So it's from a school in America. Just shows how you can do this. You can do it politely, warmly. You don't have to be really abrupt, but it's okay to stop a student in their tracks if you see that they're not addressing the question that you've asked them.
How does that room split into two different worlds by this innocent fabric tell the reader about the characters? Jocelyn.
The setting tells the reader about the characters because it shows symbols for the mother. The night is a symbol for her and what she's doing as a person. And for the sun, the scarf is a symbol for him.
But first, how does this room split by the fabric tell us about the two characters, Jocelyn? Don't say cuz. The room tells us about the fabric. The room tells us about the characters because.
The room tells us about the characters because.
Okay, so I like a couple of things about that. The way she just said, just pause, because the student was telling us about the symbolism of everything but the thing that she'd been asked for. And also the way that she just had that high expectation when the student continued on with their thought and began the sentence cause. No, we talk in full sentences here. Let's go back a bit. And, you know, that student probably felt like, oh, God, this is hard work. But that's all right for our students to feel like it's hard work. That's kind of how it needs to be. And they'll get used to that and they'll become better at giving an appropriate response in the first place. So another one, another nice example is that issue of when the student is maybe a bit vague or giving an incomplete answer, not using the correct language, and just hoping that, you know, you'll pick out the good bit in their answer. Well, it's about expecting more. And in this example, it's amazing actually how much she gets out of this student. And there's a little bit of that no opt out, and where she goes to somebody else to get them to help him develop his answer. But if you think about the quality of the answer that he produces at the end, and how easy it would have been just to accept something a lot less in depth and a much more mediocre response, but she doesn't, she keeps going. So this is another good one to demonstrate that.
You should box it up if you haven't already. This describes Aunt Alexandra. Thoughts? No.
I agree with Naomi that Aunt Alexandra is preoccupied with heredity because she's because her family, the family's past what's his name, Simon. Well, the dad, because he was really great. So back then
he owned a what?
In a farm.
Not just any kind of farm.
Oh, it's Spence Landing.
Which was it? Monique? Nope. Fine. It was, which means he had.
Yeah, a lot of money.
And? Kiara? Correct. He had what? Continue your thought.
I think that she's trying to look back on that and she's still preoccupied on it. So she's trying to act she's still trying to act like that while the other family is not.
Act like what?
Act rich. I don't know.
Tell me more. You're right. Continue.
She's trying to act rich because wasn't she wearing the way she was wearing things she's trying to present herself she's superior to the rest of the family.
And you know that students had to work really hard, but then it just the facial expressions of the teacher. She's so proud of him, the smile. She's really happy with what he's ended up with. It was worth his while doing it. And he'll be feeling proud of himself to that response as well, because he's come so much further than he might have done. So I just think that there's little things that we can do. And some of it is about having an idea in our head of what we expect as a good quality answer. So, you know, when we pre-plan our questions, we pre-plan the things that we're going to ask our students to do, but do we also pre-plan what's an acceptable answer and just keep pushing the students until they can get there? And yes, drawing upon the help from other students and then coming back to the original until they get there. But it's about having those standards as well. So I think we need some scripts, and I put the little image of the Behaviour Ninja because that was the first time I'd ever really thought about scripts and having scripts ready for your practice in the classroom. Most of you will remember that training that we had, and I'm sure a lot of the things that Jane will talk about in her training links to those sorts of ideas as well. But I think we can have scripts in terms of in the classroom and those high expectations in terms of teaching and learning. I think we need to have a few ready so we're not on the back foot. So when we ask a student a question and they give us a poor answer or partially complete answer, that we've got something ready that is supportive and positive, but also demanding the highest expectations. So things like, I like most of what you've said there, but there was a really specialist word missing that would have just elevated that. Say it again. Can you think what that word is? Right, let's go again. Or things like, there's clearly some great thinking going on, but let's just look back at the question that we were meant to be answering and focus on that. Now, you need your own scripts. Like, they can't be somebody else's, and they need to feel natural, and you need to just get used to using them. And you might just have 2 or 3 phrases that you use all the time, and the students will just learn to expect them until they address the issue. But I think we shouldn't shy away from saying to a student, no, you're not quite there yet, even if it's a student who doesn't always contribute. So we need to praise and we need to reward contributions, but we need to push them for them to be the fully correct answers and the fully correct contributions. And I think we can also have a few scripts ready to put the responsibility onto the student. So if we've just given an explanation, obviously we would think it would be a clear and thorough explanation. But before we then say, right, over to you, put a bit of responsibility onto the student. Who needs me to go through another example? Who needs me to explain that a different way? Who needs me to explain that further? No hands? Right, let's go. So then the responsibility's on them. That's that high expectation that they're doing the thinking. And if they're not quite there, that they should ask you. Now, we know they won't always, and that's why we check for understanding. And we're watching the room and seeing who's struggling to get started. But I think we can give some thought to the scripts and the language that we use in the classroom. And I think as well, and it comes back to this idea of setting the standards, like I said, planning the quality of answer that you would expect and then pushing the students to get there, thinking about the kind of high expectations of what excellence looks like. And in the walkthroughs book, there's a phrase on the setting standards walkthrough, which I think is on page 84, I think it is. What does excellence look like? And make that such a regular dialogue in the class. Every time you're setting students up to do something, to answer a question, to do a piece of writing, constantly make that part of the conversation. So what does excellence look like on this task? And then so often that they actually internalize that question. And eventually we get to the point where students are asking themselves that question and then they're aiming for that excellence. Select the more demanding curriculum options. So this is, of course, high expectations in terms of curriculum. In the Michaela book, there's a chapter which is brilliant, fascinating, quite controversial, especially with the whole kind of Black Lives Matter discussion about why they teach Mozart, not Stormzy. But I loved it. And there is that issue of not dumbing down curriculum, not trying to make it too relevant if it means not delivering important knowledge. And in the walkthroughs, there's a walkthrough for Pitch It Up. So it says, think about, can those students Is it within reach? Yes, it will be challenging, but is it within reach? If so, let's pitch it up, let's go for it. And thinking about your lesson in terms of the students thinking rather than the doing. So if there's any task in there that is not involving some challenging, high quality thinking, then don't do it. Let's swap it for a task that does. And I think that's a process that many people have kind of been through over the last year or so in fine-tuning their lessons. But I just thought it was worth a reminder. So I've mentioned no opt-out, and we know when we're doing check understanding, we're doing cold calling, we ask a student a question and we don't accept I don't know, we ask them to take a reasonable risk. That's all very well saying that, but what if the student's like, no, I just don't know, miss? And then you go to another student and they say, I don't know. Well, you might at that point decide, okay, I'm going to reteach that. I'm going to show you another example. But I think, again, it's worth having a few strategies, maybe a couple of scripts ready for that situation where students say, I don't know. So one of the simplest ways is you go to another student, they give the answer, hopefully, or you give the answer in the way that you would expect it to be kind of articulated, and then you go back to them. You have to go back to them. So now what is it? So now can you answer that question? Because they'll very quickly learn they have to be listening and they will be expected to give an answer. Also around this idea of listening, and you're not trying to catch students out, but you're just making sure they very quickly learn that they have to listen. If you see a student looking a bit disengaged, or from previous experience they're quite a poor listener, then you actually say to them, I'm going to ask 5 questions. One of them is going to be for you. So they know they have to listen and they have to be ready. So it's just a bit of pre-warning, really. Another strategy that is mentioned in the Michaela book, there's a nice chapter about assessment for learning and asking lots of questions. And it's this idea that everybody writes. So when you ask a question, before anybody gives a verbal response, everybody writes something down. Now that could be on a whiteboard if it was, say, a maths problem, or it could be in an exercise book, but everybody writes it. And then you can spot who's not engaging. So that's another nice option for no opt-out. But underpinning all that, give them more thinking time, because we don't want to create this really high-pressured environment where nobody dares, to speak or to, what if I get it wrong? But we want everybody to know that they could be called upon to answer a question. So let's be fair to them. Let's give them some thinking time. Occasionally, let's give them the think pair, time to talk it through with a partner before they might be called upon to answer in front of everybody. So there's things we can build in as well to make this, a nice classroom environment. So I've put a diagram there of the self-fulfilling prophecy. And this again is about high expectations of curriculum and of the knowledge that we expect our students to have. Now, I'm sure I can think of some for my subjects that there are particular topics or maybe skills or particular bits that you just think, oh, students always find this really dry or boring, or this is really hard. There's bound to be, but an important message, and this came through in the Teach Like a Champion book, is not to allow that to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and to just be really careful about our language. So don't ever apologize for the difficulty or the piece of learning for your subject. And I know that might sound really obvious, and you might think, well, I would never say that. But actually, I think sometimes we do it subconsciously. Oh, well, this is tricky, but we'll get through this bit. Well, it could be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy where the student thinks, oh, well, this is really hard, I'm not going to be able to do it. So it's about having some alternative scripts. And there's a few examples there. So, this is great because it's really challenging, or, oh, there's a great story behind this. We know how much storytelling can help open up learning. This gets more and more fascinating as you come to understand it better. Or, being honest and saying, look, a lot of people are afraid of this kind of maths or this kind of learning or these words. So after you've mastered it, you're going to know more than many adults, and really bigging that up, like this is something to be proud of. This is one of the things you're going to take real pride in knowing. So, and again, they need to be phrases or scripts that you're comfortable with and that come naturally to you. But I think we have to start using them, because it is about having that high expectation of knowledge as well. Okay, so I'm just going. So I'm just going to share this with you. Jane has organised for some equipment mats to be put into step groups, so the tutor can just quickly see at a glance that the students got all their equipment out. And on the other side of it, we decided to make use of the space, and I've put this together. And I thought it was important for you to see it as well, so we're all sort of on the same page in terms of those routines and those expectations. So there's nothing new on there or surprising. It's just little reminders like that the student should, check their work and self-edit before they're handing something into submission, and that they should take pride in that work, and those expectations that we know around, completing the retrieval task in silence and getting all of the things out at the beginning of the lesson, including the knowledge folder. So it's just really about a reminder about all of those things as a school we ask students to do, and your role in as a classroom teacher when you're meeting your students for the first time, how you can establish those really positive routines, and in the long run it makes everybody's life so much easier. And I just want to finish by, and this no doubt will overlap with Jane's session as well, but just by sharing a few quotes from the Michaela book that I thought were particularly powerful, and just little reminders really not to ever lower our expectations. So the first one, thinking about those challenging students. When faced with particularly challenging pupils, it's fair to say that building up a positive relationship can be challenging, but never lower your standards in pursuing that relationship. If you do, then you risk undermining the relationship in the long run, as it will gradually become clear to the pupil that you don't believe they can achieve as much as others. And I think that even comes down to the simplest of things, like expecting them to have a green pen. If it's for a financial reason, fair enough, the school will provide them with the equipment, but once they've been provided with it, why on earth would that student not be able to bring it with them? And if we accept that if we let them off, oh well, there's a lot going on in their life, we don't expect them to have that, well then we're saying to them, we're giving them the message that they can't do what every other student in that class can do. And obviously it builds up to lots of other things as well. And it is that age-old sort of what you permit, you promote. I know Andy often talks about that. And challenging in a warm way, in an educative kind of way, challenging those little behaviours that we just are not willing to accept, because if we accept them, then we promote them and we give the message to everybody else that that's okay. So another quote from the book, the year 7 shrugging at you is one step closer to becoming the year 10 swearing at you. And, I know we're lucky we don't deal with lots of students who feel it's acceptable to swear at teachers, or anybody for that matter. But that sort of student who just thinks it's okay to, that sort of shrugging, well, no, that's if we permit that, we're sending the message to everybody else that we promote that sort of response, and we don't. And another quotation, when we let them off, we let them down. And I think that's quite, that sums up a lot in a very short phrase. And obviously the children that the Michaela School deal with are very different to ours, and there is a real risk for their children of them getting involved in gang and knife culture. But there's one example in the book about a young man called Asher who hasn't done his homework. And the teacher knows that his brother's in prison for holding somebody at knife point, and knows that Asher's in real danger of joining a gang himself. And the teacher thinks, should I let him off with his homework that he hasn't completed? No, because I'll fast forward, and even though Asher at the moment is a year 7 student who hasn't done his homework, fast forward to when he's year 11 and he's failed to achieve his GCSEs, and he's now very much more vulnerable to entering into that kind of life of gang crime. I'm not going to let him off with his homework. And that's a hard decision to make, and it's a hard conversation to have. But if I let him off, I'm letting him down. Now, I know that's a really extreme example, but I think the sentiment is there. So I'm going to leave you with that, which is hopefully a nice segue into Jane's section now, which is very much about those behavioural expectations and how we can ensure there's a consistency.
Hi everyone, I hope you're all safe and well, and are looking forward to a well-deserved break during the 6 weeks holidays. Welcome to the first in several of behaviour management, behaviour training sessions that we're going to be delivering this year. I think it'd be quite a difficult thing to do, to deliver behaviour management training sessions to such a wide range of staff. Obviously, we have NQTs who are just new to this. We have many more experienced members of staff who have been in the classroom a long time. But what I would hope is that there's something that everyone can take from this, just one tiny little point to make you think, to make you review and refine your classroom practice as well. So I'm going to start today's session just by pointing to this image really. If you don't know what this image is, it's an image from Duolingo, which is a language learning app. I've actually been learning Italian since the beginning of lockdown, and it's been really useful in many respects. Obviously, I'm learning a new language, but also it's put me in the position of actually having to be a learner again. And I have to admit that I found it really difficult at times. It's been very frustrating. I've been stuck on particular issues like possessive pronouns. It took me forever to get the hang of in Italian. So it's made me think a lot about what it must be like being a learner at Fram. The other thing that I've taken from this really is the importance of these three areas: consistency, communication, and caring. And I think that's what I'm going to base this first session around today. But before we have a look at those, I'd just like you to consider some general points first of all. When we had Dave in school last year to do some behaviour management training with us, he talked a lot about scripts and about writing scripts to deal with particular situations. I'm going to use scripts throughout this session, so there'll be examples of those in red if you need to refer to them at any point as well. But I would encourage you, if you are facing a particular situation time and time again, that you do write the script to help you to deal with it confidently as well. I know this is a little bit corny, but pip and rip wherever you can. So praise in public, but if you're going to reprimand, do it in private. So move over to a student and have a word with them about their behaviour. Because if you start shouting at a student, they're only going to respond in the same way. They're going to probably want to show off in front of their friends, answer back, be cheeky. But if you just go across to them and have that quiet word with them, it's going to be much more manageable in the long run. Please consider that there's always a bigger picture. So whatever decision you actually take in school has an impact on someone else. So if you're deciding to veer away from whatever the accepted standards are with regard to the stage process or anything else, it can actually cause issues for the members of staff. So please bear in mind that there's always a bigger picture, and quite often it's a pastoral team picking up the pieces when people start doing their own individual things as well. And the final point I'd ask you to consider is just this really. This is a quotation from one of my favourite novels, To Kill a Mockingbird. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb in his skin and walk around in it. We do have a lot of students with very complex and challenging lives. So sometimes the last thing on their mind will be doing a piece of homework for you. And I'm not saying there that they shouldn't have to do that homework, but if you're going to tackle them about it, just bear in mind that there could be other things going on at home as well, and the pastoral team can help inform you about these. So if we move to consistency first of all, I'm sure you've seen this many times, but it's still important, and I'm going to take every opportunity that I can to reiterate it. Please have the same expectations of all students, and don't make excuses for any students. So if you have a top set class, the expectations for those and the type of work that they will complete will be very different from the expectations of the type of work the nurture class will complete. So it's not about asking the same classes to do the same work, but it's about having those standards and those expectations that whatever work you are asking for students to complete, you have it of all students and you don't make excuses for any single student. You might want to say something like, Sarah, you know what I'm expecting you to do in this lesson. If you need some extra support with that, we can spend some time together on a lunchtime to help you with that. And what that does is it actually signals to Sarah that if she's not going to complete that work, she's going to have to come back at a lunchtime, which I think is a much more subtle and effective way of actually just saying to her, right, you haven't done your work, you want attention at lunchtime now. What happens if that still doesn't work, if Sarah still doesn't do her work? Well, we have actually changed the procedure slightly. Lack of effort and lack of work has been taken out of the stage process. And I know that your curriculum leaders have been meeting with you to explain what the process is now. And it involves kind of you keeping a track on a student not working, you having them back to do that work in a separate time, you making phone calls home so that parents are aware, and then there's a kind of gradual staged process if students still don't do that work, or there's another occasion as well, or several occasions where they don't do that work, and your head of department, your curriculum leader will step in and help with that as well. Wherever you can, please be in your classroom before students. The amount of issues that we have because staff aren't there before the students is unbelievable, really. And I know that there's some occasions where you can't get there if you have been on duty, but if you can be there, you need to be there before your students, and you need to be greeting them when they come into the classroom and dismissing them after they've lined up behind their chairs at the end of the lesson as well. So you have those set procedures for every lesson. It gives you a real opportunity to greet students and say some nice things as well, like, "Good morning, Shannon, I've just been reading your homework and I'm so impressed by your responses. I know you're going to have another brilliant lesson today and I'm looking forward to seeing what you can actually produce today." Please make sure that every planner, knowledge organiser and piece of equipment is on the desk in every single lesson as well. And you might signal that to the students if they don't automatically do that. What should we have on our desks at the beginning of every lesson, everyone? This is so important. We're still seeing a number of classrooms around the school where this doesn't happen. And again, I think this is one of those things that undermine other teachers, because we often have students saying, "Well, we didn't have to do it in science, but we've got to do it in maths. Why is that?" So we're all doing the same. We have that consistency across the school, and eventually students will just get very used to that being part of their normal procedure, that they get their equipment out, all of their equipment out at the beginning of the lesson. Just a reminder as well about the cold calling strategy for questioning. So when we ask questions, we don't expect students to put their hands up, so we choose one of those students who has their hands up. We decide which student we want to answer a question. It's otherwise known as the no hands up strategy. So you're choosing exactly who you want to answer which question you have just posed as well. When you give an instruction, please make sure it's followed. I think it's very easy and very tempting, particularly when you're a new teacher. If you insist on silent working and the students don't do it, and they're kind of whispering quietly under their breath for you to think, "Well, actually, that's nearly quiet." Well, no, it isn't. If you've insisted on silent work, and silent means silent, it means their heads down and them concentrating on exactly what it is that you've asked them to do. So please make sure that you insist and follow up on everything you've asked. Think about the one-way system around school. This is more important now than ever. If you see a student going the wrong way, just take that time to go to them and say, "You're not going the right way. This was explained to you in the induction period. Obviously, there's a reason behind this. Just redirect yourself and make sure you're kind of keeping to the left and you're following the one-way system around school, please." Follow the stage process as well. We're seeing too many teachers give additional chances or actually say, "Well, I'll take a stage off you if you behave better now." That isn't the system, it isn't the procedure. Again, it undermines others who are doing things right and following the procedure to the letter of the law. So make sure that you give a stage, you explain why, and that you log that on Sims when you have the opportunity to do that as well. At the beginning of last year, we had this real focus on politeness and manners and modelling this behaviour all of the time. So please continue to do that. If students don't say thank you, insist that they say thank you. So if you loan them a pen, although we won't be doing that at this time, but if you do loan them a pen in the future and they don't say thank you, you might say to them, "Thank you for the loan of a pen, miss," and expect them to repeat that to you as well. Make sure mobile phones are confiscated if you see them or they are not in bags. So we're going to have a real push with this. If a student has a mobile phone in their pocket, you can confiscate that. We're absolutely going to make it clear that mobile phones should be switched off and in bags. If students are seen with earphones in, assume that they are listening to music on their mobile phones. They shouldn't be listening to music at all. There are a few exceptions to this, but these will be communicated to you by Rachel Danson, our SENCO, for pupils who have special educational needs. It's a tiny minority. No one else should have earphones and should be listening. So please make sure that that doesn't happen in your classroom. If a student refuses to hand a mobile phone over, think about how you can handle that, what script you can write for that as well. So if a student refuses to hand the mobile phone over, I think I would be tempted to say to them, just pop it on the desk there. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think about that and make the right decision. And I'm going to come back and take your phone after 2 minutes is up. And I'm going to hand that to student reception and you can pick that up at the end of the day. If a student doesn't do that and refuses still to hand over the phone, well, that's absolutely fine. So that would be a stage 3 removal from the lesson. But give them that opportunity to just calm down and think through first what their decisions are and help them to make the right decision rather than jumping straight to that removal from lesson. Please can we ask for your help with uniform infringements as well, and make sure that every student is checked about this. We've got some new maths for equipment checks in tutor group, and we'd like step tutors to check uniform as they have done for quite some time now every morning. Send students down to the pastoral area if they haven't got the correct uniform, and the heads of year and pastoral managers will deal with that there. Hopefully they'll be able to sort that out quite quickly by loaning a piece of equipment or a piece of uniform, but if not, they may, in some circumstances, issue a little pink slip, which will allow students to be wearing the incorrect uniform for a very short period of time. If that continues, of course, we did have several students last year who were placed in isolation for constantly wearing the incorrect uniform, and that will continue this year as well. I'm sure it goes without saying that communication is really important. And I think particularly point 1 is something that we haven't always done. If you do have to remove a student from your classroom, please arrange to meet with them before you see them again and teach them again, just so you can have a very short conversation, making it clear what your expectations are, making it clear that it's a fresh start, and encouraging them to make the right decisions in your classroom. We realise that on some occasions that this might be quite difficult to see, and if you do need any help with this, we can perhaps facilitate maybe a pastoral manager to cover your tutor group for a few minutes until you have that conversation with the student that has been removed from your classroom. I mentioned earlier about communicating with students when you give a stage on the staged process. Make that absolutely clear. George, you've received a stage 1 for talking when I'm talking, and you continue to do that, which means you're now on a stage 2. Thanks for listening, George. I know you won't receive a stage 3 at all. So you make it absolutely clear. Don't get into any arguments if students say, I wasn't talking, miss, I wasn't doing that. Just say, George, I know what I heard, we're going to move on now, and I know you won't make any more wrong decisions in my classroom. So that communication is key as well. Obviously, I've already mentioned the fact that if students aren't making very much effort or aren't handing homework in your lessons, communicate with your curriculum leader, keep them in the loop about it. Once it gets past that first point where you've warned the student, you then need to start to refer it up to your curriculum leader. This little bit at the beginning of the screen, the corner of the screen here is the departmental process for dealing with that. And as I said earlier, your curriculum leader should have gone through that with you as well. We're going to be asking step tutors to make a positive phone call home a week for a tutee of the week, and we'd encourage you to do that as teachers as well. So if you've had a student who's had a number of stage 2s and then that stops because you've worked with them to build that relationship and the trust, please make a phone call home and let their parents know that. They will really appreciate that. And point 3 is a very important one. We often have a lot that comes back to pastoral, where parents will say to us, I didn't know this at all. I had a conversation on the phone with this member of staff, everything seemed to be fine, and now at parents' evening, they're telling me that such and such hasn't done this, that, and this. So please be as honest as you possibly can with parents as well. And finally, caring. Show, not just tell the students that you care about them. We do occasionally hold some briefing meetings about individual students or more high challenge students. They are held either first thing in the morning or at the end of a school day. They're usually very short, 10 minutes, but please turn up to these meetings. They're full of very useful information. I know there'll be some rare occasions that you can't do that, and please let the head of year know. But also understand that, in occasions in the past when we've had 4 or 5 people missing from these meetings, it means the head of year has then got to go back and have 5 separate meetings with the people that couldn't make that initial meeting. So it's about thinking about that bigger picture that I mentioned right at the beginning of this presentation as well. Care enough to follow up every last bit of work that isn't handed in. I've already mentioned about chasing work and about what the procedures are. If you let students get away with not handing a piece of work in, that says a lot to them, and they'll not hand the next piece of work, and they're not hand the next piece of work in. So that's very important. As is finding out as much information as possible about your tutees as well. And I think I've been guilty of this in the past, being a tutor. I remember one year not finding out that a girl was some national gymnast until the second year that I had her in my tutor group, and I was horrified at that. So how about devising some kind of little activity where you can find out some information about your tutees as well. Make those positive phone calls home and use your reward stamps as well. So as a teacher, teach with your reward stamp in your hand so you can reward every possible opportunity that you can to give students a stamp there. That's it for today's session. A lot of the session is based on this Teaching Walkthroughs book that you have, an excellent book by Tom Sherrington and Oliver Caniglioli. And our next sessions will focus around the key areas in the behaviour management chapter in this book as well. So we'll be looking at positive relationships, establishing expectations, signal, pause, insisting, positive framing, rehearsing routines, which we've talked a little bit about today, and choices and consequences as well. There's lots of support available within schools, so not just the support within your own departmental teams, but also the pastoral area, myself, Fran, Mark McCready, whose role is Director of Behaviour. He's going to be doing a lot of drop-in sessions around the school and supporting members of staff with some of our more high challenging students there as well. So please talk to Mark at any time, and Mark will be involved in some of our future behaviour training sessions as well. But that's it for now. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you can take something away from this session.